The subject of our discussion today is Exodus chapters 21, 22, and 23. Now, maybe a good analogy with which to begin is, you know how sometimes you can maybe be going down the street and you know it's a prime real estate location. You're trying to figure out what the buildings that you see are doing in the prime real estate location. Well, in a way, that's the situation that we find with respect to Exodus chapters 21, 22, and 23, in that they definitely are prime real estate. When one considers that in Exodus chapter 20, we read of God's revelation to Israel at Sinai, the Ten Commandments, at least Revelation at Sinai, part 1. Because, of course, in Exodus chapter 24, God summons Moses to ascend the mountain, and then we get to Revelation at Sinai, part 2. So between Revelation at Sinai, part 1, in chapter 20, and Revelation at Sinai, part 2, in chapter 24, we have, of course, chapters 21, 22, and 23. Definitely prime real estate. What are they about? And why are the subjects that are addressed in these chapters the subjects that need to be addressed in the prime real estate? So, on that note, we embark upon Exodus chapter 21. And the subject, right from the start, becomes very clear. In verse 1, now these are the ordinances. We could render them as laws or judgments that you will set before them. And of course, what is meant here by ordinances or laws or judgments is what we would describe as civil law, the laws that pertain to how to run society. Now, we've noted this in the past, but I think it certainly is important for us to stress it here. The whole notion that part of the religion is a system for administering justice is not at all obvious. Indeed, this may be one of the most important revolutions of the Bible that we encounter, after all, many societies in which there is a religion. And even if the societies have some principles of justice, the principles of justice have nothing to do with the religion. It could be an ordinary system of secular civil law. Furthermore, when you consider what was the norm in the ancient world, the idea that religion should have any concern whatsoever for justice is so not obvious as to perhaps even be counterintuitive. In the ancient pagan world, consider that worshiping the gods was first and foremost because of the fickle circumstances of the climate, of nature, even the daily weather. So you explain the fickle manner in which nature performed as a result of the fickle whims of the gods. And there certainly wasn't any deference to justice among the gods. To consider a relatively familiar example in Greek mythology, the gods cheated on one another, they took bribes, gave bribes. There was no system of justice at all that characterized the way the gods behave themselves. And here we come to the system that the Torah, that the Bible teaches. Justice is not just in there, it's veritably at the top. That is, again, sandwiched between Revelations Part 1 and Part 2. These are the ordinances, the laws, the judgments, the system of judgment that you will set before them. And maybe in particular, it is appropriate for us to consider just what sort of laws, or more specifically, laws pertaining to whom. In verse 2, if you buy a Hebrew servant, 6 years he shall serve, and in the 7th he shall go out free for nothing. The rules that pertain to a bond servant, the lowest echelons of society. Now, we'll obviously have to consider why all rules, the system of justice in Exodus chapter 21 begins with this. But before we return to the specific content, I'd also like to direct our observations to a very important motif that we find in both Exodus chapter 21 and Exodus chapter 22. And appreciating this motif necessarily forces us to consider the Hebrew. That is, in verse 5, if the servant says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free. Then, we read in verse 6, his master shall bring him, well, the translation here says, unto God. I'm going to defend the alternative translation that I put in brackets here, unto the judges, and shall bring him to the door or unto the doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. The Hebrew that's rendered as either God or the judges is over here. El ha-Elohim. Now, Elohim, in point of fact, is one of the words that we use in biblical Hebrew to refer to God. But in biblical Hebrew, the word Elohim does not only refer to God. It can refer to really any source of power at all. An overlord, a judge, people of stature, they can all be called Elohim. On a theological, philosophical plane, we can appreciate that the idea of using this word as one of the words that refer to God is because in our world we encounter all sorts of different sources of power. When you consider these various sources of power and you extrapolate from them to the supreme source of power, then you're extrapolating from this world to God, from the mundane Elohim to the divine one. So, of course, to that extent, we reiterate, this word definitely can refer to God, just not necessarily. It can also refer to a lot of other things. And here in context, I think it becomes clear that we need to understand it as a reference to the judges. And that becomes arguably even clearer when the very same motif recurs in Exodus chapter 22. In Exodus chapter 22, we consider verses 7 and 8, referring to the bailiff, the trustee, who is watching over the property of another. And in the specific instance under discussion here, the trustee claims that the article that was in trust was stolen, and we read in verse 7, if the thief is not found, then the master of the house will come near, well, again, the translation says, unto God, and I'll side with the alternative translation here, to the judges, to see whether he has not put his hand into his neighbor's goods. In other words, the master of the house here is the one who is overseeing the property that was given him in trust, and he claims the property was stolen. They go to court. The judges are going to establish whether in fact the property was stolen or if he had misappropriated it himself. And in verse 8, for every matter of trespass, whether it be for ox, for ass, for sheep, for raiment, or for any manner of lost thing, whereof one says, this is it, the cause of both parties shall come before, once again, the translation says God, and we will opt for the alternative translation, the judges. He whom, well, I think at this point, the appropriateness of the alternative translation becomes very clear. He whom the judges shall condemn shall pay double unto his neighbor. That is, first of all, what altogether would we mean by speaking of coming near to God? God, after all, transcends space. You might say, well, maybe it means to come near to the temple. But what is coming near to the temple going to accomplish in terms of this adjudication? In particular, when you consider that in verse 8, we read about the Elohim condemning one side to pay. Well, unless you have a prophet available, how could you possibly know which side God has designated as the right or the wrong? But of course, then, we recognize we aren't talking about God. At least, we aren't talking about God directly. We're talking about the judges, the court. You approach the judges. They are then charged with the adjudication, determining who is in the right and who is in the wrong, and they say who needs to pay to whom. But of course, simultaneously, while we then appreciate that in both Exodus chapter 21, verse 6, and in Exodus chapter 22, verses 7 and 8, the meaning of Elohim is really undoubtedly the judges. Significant, isn't it, that of the various words the Bible could have used to refer to the judges, this is the one. And it is, after all, a word that can refer to God. Maybe one of the most apt examples in Scripture that dramatizes this ambiguity is Psalm 82, verse 1. A psalm of Asaph. The translation here renders God stands in the congregation. Now, here, we should note the word that is translated as God, and undoubtedly appropriately translated as God, is indeed Elohim. And the second half of the verse, in the midst of, well, here the translation renders it as the judges. He judges. Now, you'll note in the Hebrew, it's exactly the same word. Elohim appears twice in this verse. Just as the translation is, I suppose, forced to concede, there's no way that you can translate both of these occurrences of the same word in the same way. It wouldn't really make sense. After all, what would we say? God stands in the congregation of God in the midst of God. God judges. Doesn't mean anything. Rather, again, we appreciate that in the first instance, inescapably, Elohim refers to God. God stands in the congregation of God. The second God here is, in Hebrew, El, another name that is used to refer to God, and indeed another word that refers to sources of power. The second half of the verse, B'kerev Elohim Yishvot, in the midst of Elohim, but here inevitably it's in the midst of the judges. He judges. Now, besides the obvious linguistic point, there's another very important message that emerges from this verse in Psalm 82. And I think it pertains directly to the choice of words in Exodus chapter 21 and Exodus chapter 22 for referring to the judges, referring to the judges by word that also means God. There is an intimate connection between God and the judges. Just consider in this verse, Psalm 82, verse 1, in the midst of the judges, He, God, judges. We're going to have to consider what that means. Who's doing the judging here? The judges or God? Not an easy question to answer. And to appreciate why, we consider what Moses tells us in Deuteronomy chapter 1, when, by way of review, recollection, he describes the circumstances of the appointment of judges. In verse 15, so I took the heads of your tribes, wise men and full of knowledge, and made them heads over you, captains of thousands, captains of hundreds, captains of 50s, and captains of 10s, and officers tribe by tribe. And what being heads means most crucially, verse 16, and I charged your judges at that time, saying, hear the causes between your brethren, and judge righteously between a man and his brother and the stranger that is with him, or between a man and his brother and his litigant. And in verse 17, the establishment of this system of justice. You shall not favor persons in judgment. You shall hear the small and the great alike. You shall not be afraid of the face of any man. Why not? For judgment is God's. What exactly that means, we're still going to have to clarify. For judgment is God's. There's on some plane, beyond the apparent linguistic reference that we encountered in Exodus chapter 21 and Exodus chapter 22, judgment fundamentally is associated with God. You'll note that in the Hebrew, we indeed find the same name of God. Here means God, Elohim, associated with Mishpat, judgment. And, of course, again, we reiterate, this is undoubtedly among the most crucial teachings of the Bible, in contrast to what was veritably axiomatic, presumed, in the ancient world. And I'll submit that if nowadays it is obvious to us that we view God as the just God, it's of course because we've learned the lessons of the Bible. It wasn't obvious before. And this is a recurrent theme. In Deuteronomy chapter 10, verses 17 and 18, we find the same expression used in referring to God. For the Lord your God, He is Elohei HaElohim. Translation, God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, the mighty and the awful, who favors not persons nor takes reward. He does execute justice. So what about justice? Elohim signifies God as judge. He executes justice for the fatherless and widow and loves the stranger in giving him food and raiment. And similarly, in Isaiah chapter 30, for the Lord is a God of justice. And once again, the Hebrew is Elohei, which is the construct form of Elohim. And once again, Mishpat, justice. Taking another example, in Psalm 7, verse 12, God is a righteous judge. And again, the Hebrew is Elohim. Same word. Shofet Tzaddik, righteous judge. Now, this is, of course, a cohesion between Elohim and justice that recurs over and over again in Scripture. I'm not going to dwell upon it excessively, but I think it's important for us to appreciate that this certainly has implications that go far beyond mere linguistics. And that brings us, in particular, to the second book of Chronicles, chapter 19, where we read of the religious reforms of King Yehoshaphat of Judah. I can't help but note here that the very name Yehoshaphat means God judges. And what indeed is described here is Yehoshaphat's campaign of justice. In chapter 19, verse 5, and he set judges in the land throughout all the fortified cities of Judah, city by city. Verse 6, and said to the judges, consider what you do, for you judge not for man, but for God, and He is with you in giving judgment. That is, for all appearances, who is the employer of the judges? Answer, He is, Yehoshaphat, the king. Isn't he the employer? And he tells them, no, I'm not your employer. God is your employer. That when you become a judge, you become, so to speak, God's junior partner. And therefore, bear this in mind. You judge not for man, but for God. He is with you in giving judgment. Now, therefore, let the fear of God be upon you. Take heed and do it, for there is no iniquity with God our Lord, nor favor of persons, nor taking of bribes. And again, in this vein, he bids the Levites and the priests. Also, the judgment of God is part of their responsibilities too. And in the verses that follow, once again, the stress upon doing that which is right, warning the people that they be not guilty toward God, because you have a responsibility vested in you by God. But now, we can't help but note that there is a certain tension emerging in what we've seen here. And maybe the best way of expressing it is when one considers his warning in verse 6. On the one hand, stressing, you judge not for men, but for God. So you better be careful. Consider what you do. But on the other hand, He is with you in giving judgment. So who's in charge of the dispensation of justice here? You judges or God? not necessarily an easy question to answer. We should stress that, returning to Deuteronomy, besides the verses we already discussed in chapter 1 that describe in retrospect the appointment of judges, we read in Deuteronomy chapter 16 famous words concerning the ongoing commandment to appoint judges, present, future, always, forever. Indeed, with respect to the appointment of judges, we ought to stress that this is not a law that we deem even unique to Israel. We've spoken on many occasions of the Noahide covenant, the 7 Noahide laws. Well, one of the 7 Noahide laws is the establishment of a system of justice. So, it is in that vein that we consider the message here in Deuteronomy chapter 16. This is the commandment in the Torah with respect to the appointment of judges. Judges and officers shall you make in all your gates that God your Lord gives you, tribe by tribe, and they shall judge the people with righteous judgment. You shall not pervert judgment. You shall not favor persons, neither shall you take a gift, for a gift blinds the eyes of the wise and perverts the words of the righteous. This is a recurrent theme with respect to judgment, that justice needs to be blind without recognizing, showing favoritism to anybody. And the famous words in verse 20, justice, justice, shall you pursue, that you may live and possess the land that God your Lord gives you. We will yet have occasion to return to this perplexing association between the pursuit of justice and the possession of the land. But for now, let's stress that this theme of maintenance of justice is one that indeed we encounter over and over again, the foundational importance of recognizing that God is the author of justice and that we associate justice with him in Deuteronomy chapter 32. The rock, his work is perfect, for all his ways are justice. The God of faithfulness and without iniquity, just and upright is he. In Jeremiah chapter 11, O Lord of hosts, judges righteously. In Psalm 9, verse 5, you have maintained my justice and my cause. You sit upon the throne as the righteous judge. Again, a very recurrent theme with respect to the importance of maintaining justice. But now, when we consider the interplay between, on the one hand, describing God as the judge, and on the other hand, the mandate for us to judge, we can't help but concede that there is a tension here. Who's in charge of dispensing justice? Whose responsibility is it? Is it God's? Or is it ours? We could, after all, well imagine either scenario. That is, we could imagine a system in which God says, forget about dispensing justice. I'll take care of it. I will mete out punishments for miscarriage of justice. I will punish the people who wrong one another. Civil law is my department. You could imagine such a system. It might be difficult to envision how it would work on a regular basis. It certainly would make our lives, in a sense, easy, because then we don't need to judge any cases. We could also, of course, imagine the opposite. That God says, this is your responsibility. You need to see to it that justice is served. And obviously, on some plane, the very fact that there is this mandate to establish a court system does militate in that direction. Obviously, we can't just sit back and say, okay, God, you take care of everything. And yet, as I think inevitably emerges when we consider what the Torah conveys to us, especially in Exodus chapter 23, especially, but not exclusively, we realize that besides the two scenarios that I just suggested, is a third. And the third is critical. Returning to Exodus, again, Exodus chapter 23, we read in verse 6, "You shall not pervert the judgment of your poor in his cause." And in verse 8, "You shall take no gift, for a gift blinds them that have sight and perverts the words of the righteous." That is, obviously, these verses very clearly affirm the critical importance of your dispensing justice. You're in charge. It's your responsibility. So therefore, don't pervert justice. Don't take bribes. Pay attention and do the job right. And not surprisingly, this is very much a recurrent theme in the Bible, especially in the Torah. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 15, "You shall do no unrighteousness in judgment. You shall not favor the person of the poor, nor favor the person of the mighty, but in righteousness shall you judge your neighbor." In Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 17, "You shall not pervert the justice due to the stranger or to the fatherless, nor take the widow's raiment pledge." And this emphasis in particular upon the stranger, the orphan, and the widow is definitely a recurrent one. Besides the explicit prohibition in Deuteronomy chapter 24, in chapter 27, verse 19, the curse. "Cursed be he who perverts the justice due to the stranger, fatherless, and widow." Same threesome. And all the people shall say, Amen. And similarly, in Isaiah chapter 1, learn to do well, seek justice, relieve the oppressed, judge for the fatherless, plead for the widow. Recalling Psalm 82, the first verse of which we discussed at the outset, the third verse is, "Judge for the poor and fatherless, do justice to the afflicted and destitute." And inevitably, one can't help but note here, in Psalm 82, that tension is manifested itself. The first verse spoke of God judging in the midst of the judges, implying that he's the one who's in charge. He runs the show. He dispenses justice. But in verse 3, this is clearly expressed as a mandate to us, to human judges. You judge for the poor and the fatherless. You do justice to the afflicted and destitute. Well, the truth is, besides the tension that we see in Psalm 82, we see this tension explicitly in Exodus chapter 23 itself. I kind of set things up in a somewhat contrived manner by quoting for you in Exodus chapter 23, verse 6 and verse 8. But what about verse 7? In verse 7, we see what, upon investigation, is a very different message. Verse 7, "Keep far from a false matter." Well, that certainly sounds like what we've seen in the previous sources as well, bidding us to ensure that justice is served. And the continuation, "And the innocent and righteous slay not, for I will not justify the wicked." Now, this continuation in verse 7 is troubling. Indeed, it is arguably baffling. First of all, in the midst of a list of warnings with respect to maintaining the highest standards of justice, what's the purpose of telling us that one is not to slay the innocent and the righteous? Would anyone have thought that the innocent and righteous one is permitted to slay? So the very notion of a mandate of this sort is in itself perplexing. But furthermore, we consider the continuation of the verse. For I will not justify the wicked. Why here is God's dispensation of justice intruding into the discussion? And inevitably then, I feel compelled to share with you what this verse means in our tradition. You know, we are very well acquainted in Western society, in Western systems of justice, with the principle called double jeopardy. Meaning, if a suspected criminal is tried for the crime and found innocent, then even if after his acquittal new evidence surfaces that he's really guilty, what do? Nothing. You cannot try a person twice for the same crime. If he was acquitted, he's acquitted. Well, this principle of double jeopardy did not originate in Western society. It originated in Exodus chapter 23, verse 7. That is, in our ancient tradition, the meaning of and the innocent and righteous slay not is precisely this subject. We aren't speaking of someone who is, in every sense of the term, innocent, righteous, blameless. On the contrary, we're speaking of someone who emerged from his trial innocent and righteous because he was acquitted. Why would you think that you should slay him? Because in fact, he really was criminal. He was guilty. He is culpable. He's culpable, but not in your court. And this then is the prohibition here, double jeopardy, that once someone emerges from your court, innocent and righteous, you can't slay him. But now, here's where we get to the subtle complexity. And it's not only crucial in understanding the verse, I think it's crucial in understanding the legal system altogether. You know, in Western society, the principle of double jeopardy, on the one hand, may make sense to us to not keep on holding the person into court over and over again for the same crime. But on the other hand, if we really do know that this is the criminal, if we really do know, based upon new evidence, that he is guilty, why should he be allowed to go scot-free? Why shouldn't he need to answer for his crimes? I have to admit that in a secular legal system, that question is vexingly unanswerable. There's an answer in Exodus chapter 23, verse 7. And that answer is, God says, for I will not justify the wicked. That is, returning to the question, who's in charge of the legal system? Is God going to take care of everything? Or are we? Are human judges? The answer is, with respect to the two simple alternatives that we noted at the outset, either God takes care of it or we take care of it, complex. Neither of the above. Or maybe we should say both of the above. Because, on the one hand, the one who is in charge of the legal system, unequivocally, is the one who is judge. It's God's responsibility indeed. And that's precisely what we read in Exodus chapter 23, verse 7. I will not justify the wicked. I'll make sure that the guilty party ultimately pays for his crime. But while, on the one hand, God is the one who is responsible for the final execution of justice, he bids us, he demands of us to participate, to be his junior partners. That means, then, that the first layer in the dispensation of justice is you need to judge. You need to bring in the suspected criminal. You need to try him. And you need to see if, based upon the criteria for conviction, you can convict him. If you can, it's your responsibility. If you can, God says, it's my responsibility. That is, the truth is, it's always God's responsibility, but God charges us to be the dispensers of his justice to the extent that we can do so. That's the same idea we discern in Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 15. One witness shall not rise up against a man for any iniquity or for any sin. In any sin that he sins, at the mouth of two witnesses or at the mouth of three witnesses shall a matter be established. Here we have it, rather explicitly, that matters of judgment are to be established by the eyewitness testimony of specifically two or more witnesses, not one. Well, why not one? Why can't you determine what the ruling of the court should be based upon one witness? I suppose the answer is intuitively obvious to us, because it's only one witness, and you have no other witness to cross-examine against the testimony of the first witness, then you have no way of knowing, is he telling the truth, is he lying? It's just his word against the litigant. You really don't know. So one witness is insufficient. That, at least, is intuitively clear. What isn't is, why are two witnesses any better? Because it's impossible for two witnesses to dupe the court, to arrange their testimony in advance, so they'll say the same thing and their testimony will be accepted. It certainly isn't impossible. We have, of course, a very famous instance in the Book of Kings when Jezebel, the wife of King Ahav, contrives to have witnesses testify against Naboth, the Jezreelite, and by consequence, he is convicted and executed. An innocent man that provides the in for Ahav to seize his vineyard. He was innocent. There was a trial. There were witnesses. They lied. It can happen, even when there are two or more witnesses. So while we intuitively understand very well why one witness is insufficient, why are two sufficient? And while, again, I'll reiterate that in a secular legal system, the answer to that question almost inevitably is because we draw some arbitrary line of demarcation and say, if the level of corroborative evidence is beyond that line, we listen. If it's beneath that line, we don't listen. Works, but it's still arbitrary. In the laws of the Torah, the way to address this issue is fundamentally different. You could already anticipate. The one who bears final responsibility for justice is God. The reason we operate based upon the testimony of two witnesses and not on the testimony of one is, at the risk of sounding simplistic, God said so. God said so, and therefore, in effect, God tells us, once this threshold is crossed, I want you to be my junior partners. I want you to take responsibility. I want you to be involved in the process. If the threshold isn't crossed, if there's only one witness, or in any set of circumstances in which there are no witnesses, well, God says, then it's my responsibility. I'll take care of it. And again, we reiterate, what we glean from this, the sense that emerges from this, is that ultimately the dispensation of justice is God's responsibility. Return to Exodus chapter 21 and Exodus chapter 22. The word for judges is a name for God. The dispensation of justice is God's domain. And yet, remember, while it's the same word refers to judges, God does demand of us to engage in the process. We need to become partners in sustaining the world that He created by doing our best to ensure that justice is served. But doing our best, of course, doesn't mean being able to do everything. God takes responsibility that ultimately justice is served. So this, we stress, is a crucial insight with respect to what's taking place in Exodus chapters 21 and on. It's about a civil law system, about empowering the judges and simultaneously recognizing justice, ultimately, is God's responsibility. There's an additional dimension, and this additional dimension is undoubtedly critical in our integrating what takes place in these three chapters, and that's the end of Exodus chapter 23. The end of Exodus chapter 23, at first brush, seems completely disjointed from what precedes it. And I will set your border from the Red Sea even to the sea of the Philistines, and from the wilderness unto the river, for I will deliver the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and you shall drive them out before you. And in verse 33, they shall not dwell in your land, lest they make you sin against me, or you will serve their gods, for they will be a snare unto you. The gift of the land of Israel, and the culpability of its current inhabitants. This is something that we read in a number of portions in the Bible, especially in the Torah, in Leviticus chapter 18, after the doings of the land of Egypt, wherein you dwelt, you shall not do, and after the doings of the land of Canaan, where I'm bringing you, you shall not do. You shall not walk in their statutes. Rather, you are to do my ordinances. You keep my statutes and my ordinances. You keep my rules of justice. And in keeping those rules of justice, there is a stress. That way, and only that way, do you merit dwelling in the land. In Leviticus chapter 20, verse 22, you shall therefore keep my statutes and all my ordinances and do them, that the land where I bring you to dwell therein not vomit you out. Dwelling in the land demands of you. You need to be morally worthy of the inheritance. And you shall not walk in the customs of the nations which I am casting out before you, for they did all these things, and therefore I abhorred them. They are being driven out of the land, not merely to give you a piece of real estate, but because they have earned divine extirpation. You have been charged to be the instrument in God's hands to bring upon them their richly deserved punishment. And, of course, the corollary with respect to your being worthy of being in the land is self-evident and repeated over and over again in Scripture. In Leviticus chapter 25, verse 18, wherefore you shall do my statutes and keep my ordinances and do them, and then you shall dwell in the land in safety. In Deuteronomy chapter 4, beginning in verse 1, now, O Israel, hearken unto the statutes and unto the ordinances that I teach you to do them, that you may live and come in and possess the land that God, Lord of your fathers, gives you. In verse 5, behold, I have taught you statutes and ordinances, even as God, my Lord, commanded me, that you should do so in the midst of the land where you are coming to possess it. In verse 14, again, God commanded me at that time to teach you statutes and ordinances that you might do them in just measures. Verse 15, a perfect and just weight you shall have, a perfect and just measure shall you have, that your days may be long upon the land that God your Lord gives you. Again, you get the land because you keep justice. So, in a general sense, of course, we can very well appreciate the message of all this. That is, the message is, the land is a reward. If you earn the reward, then you get the land. If you don't earn the reward because of miscarriage of justice, then you forfeit the land. And undoubtedly, that is a critical part of it. But I think there's more to it than that. And it is in that vein in particular that I feel compelled to stress not just the aspects of civil law generally that were presented at the beginning of Exodus chapter 21, but the specific content. The servant, the lowest echelons of society. The emphasis on the lowest echelons of society. The folks who you might think aren't really that important altogether. Of course, they are. Not only are they important, society itself is judged more than anything else by how it cares for its weakest members. And this brings me to the subject of Jeremiah chapter 34, which is particularly relevant in that it, like the opening verses in Exodus chapter 21, speaks about servants. I can't help but add here that in synagogues, when Exodus chapter 21 is read from the Torah, Jeremiah chapter 34 is read as the corresponding reading from the prophets, because in a way it is indeed the same subject. We don't have time to consider the content of the chapter in detail, so we'll just summarize, beginning in verse 8. The word that came to Jeremiah from God, that there had been a covenant to let all of the servants free according to the rules of the Torah, and all the princes and all the people hearkened, and that's what they did. Except that, in verse 11, afterward they turned and caused the servants and the handmaids whom they had let go free to return, and brought them into subjection for servants and for handmaids. That is, we obeyed the law of the Torah to free the bondmen and bondwomen, but only temporarily. And then they conquered them again, brought them into subjugation once more. And this is the background for this prophecy that God gives to prophet Jeremiah. In verse 13, thus says, Lord God of Israel, I made a covenant with your fathers in the day that I brought them forth out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, saying, what we saw in Exodus chapter 21. At the end of 7 years, 6 years the bondman works, then he is set free. And while in verse 15, you were now turned that had done that which is right in my eyes and proclaimed liberty every man to his neighbor. Then in verse 16, you turned and profaned my name, and caused every man his servant and every man his handmaid, who you have God their pleasure to return. And you brought them into subjection to be unto you for servants and for handmaids. That wasn't only a crime of civil law. It was that too. It was more than civil law that was violated. It was a profanation of God's name by having perpetrated such evil by his people in his land. Therefore, thus says God, you have not hearkened unto me to proclaim liberty every man to his brother, every man to his neighbor. Behold, I proclaim for you liberty, says God, unto the sword, unto the pestilence, unto the famine, and I will make you a horror unto all the kingdoms of earth. There is a grievous prophecy of retribution that pertains to the land and culminates in verse 22. Behold, I will command, says God, and cause them, the Babylonians, to return to this city, and they will fight against it and take it and burn it with fire. And I will make the cities of Judah a desolation without inhabitants. The land isn't just a reward. There's something far more profound going on. The land is intended as a stage, a platform through which you are summoned to broadcast to the world what happens when society follows God's bidding and establishes perfect, godly society. You get the land as the means for that. As aptly expressed in Isaiah chapter 2, verse 3, and many peoples will come and say, go and let us go up to the mountain of God, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion will go forth teaching, and the word of God from Jerusalem. They're all supposed to see that. You know, some years ago, I saw a fascinating letter that was written by a Roman traveler around 2,000 years ago. He came through this land, the land of Israel, and he described what, to him, were the barbaric practices of the inhabitants. They hardly have any slaves. They let their slaves go. They also take off one day every 7 and call it a Sabbath. All sorts of barbaric practices they regard as totally uncivilized. It's taken a long time for the definition of civilization to catch up with the mandates of the Bible. But of course, what I'm stressing here is, if you're not going to be living up to those standards, what God bids you to do in order to establish that model, godly, refined society in the land, you lose the land. You have no right to the land if you aren't living up to that mandate. This is what we read in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 15 and 16. See, I have set before you this day life and good and death and evil, and that I command you this day to love God your Lord, to walk in his ways, to keep his commandments, his statutes, and his ordinances, the laws. Then you will live and multiply. God your Lord will bless you in the land where you are coming in to possess it. Again. So that's means. It's not just reward. It's where you are to establish that model society, to refine yourselves, refine your communities, and serve as a model to refine the world. That's the ultimate goal here, after all. So long as the system of justice, the system of civil law, is merely mundane, then okay, it can work in varying degrees in attaining its goals, so much. The system of justice, the system of civil law, needs to be religious. It needs to be a basis for becoming godly, because it is through that system that the people will submit to that system, and the society in which that system is practiced become emissaries of God and godliness to the world. That is the essential goal. As expressed in Hosea chapter 2, verse 21, and I will betroth you, says God, unto me forever. I will betroth you unto me in righteousness and in justice and in loving kindness and in compassion. That's the way we become betrothed to God. First and foremost, look at the two items here at the beginning of the list: righteousness and justice. The last, final one: I will betroth you unto me in faithfulness, and you will know God. Through righteousness and justice. So that, then, in summation, is why prime real estate goes where it does in Exodus chapters 21, 22, and 23. Because we need to learn this. Specifically, sandwiched between the two parts of God's revelation. God's revelation. The highest level of communion with God. And how do you express that in practice? By establishing a system of civil law that is religious, God-given, and that pertains to the weakest members of society, and that teaches you that what the judges do, they do on behalf of God. That what the judges do, they do because, on the one hand, God remains responsible for the dispensation of justice. But on the other hand, God demands of us to pursue justice, to execute justice, to do our utmost within the bounds of what we can do to make this world a better place. When we do that, then we become worthy of promise. In Isaiah chapter 56, verse 1. Thus says God, keep you justice and do righteousness. My salvation is near to come, and my favor to be revealed. May we indeed integrate this lesson from Exodus chapters 21, 22, and 23, and all the other passages that we saw. This message
of justice. This message of justice. And appreciating again that by civil law becoming religious, we as individuals and as society are summoned to become the greatest blessing of all. May we integrate it into our lives. God bless.